Hello, everybody. My name is Kenny Johnston. I'm a director in our product organization. I am going to do a walkthrough today for what I'm calling ops section naming. So this is something that I'm going to go ahead and share my screen that I have been thinking about recently, as we have had a couple of, not that one, this one. Right, okay. So I've had a couple of customer conversations and other discussions where people had mentioned to me that the naming we use, or lack of names that we use for some objects in GitLab CI/CD and the ops section in general, can be confusing. And so I actually saw Vitika highlight this in a video for some of the enhancements that are coming for pipelines, but I wanted to showcase this kind of more broadly because I think it's pretty common, and maybe by me recording this walkthrough and showcasing some of the concerns I have about it, we can think about it a little bit more holistically. So let me get started. Actually, I'm going to drag this screen over here, and then hopefully you all can see this. Okay, so let me just stop sharing and make sure I'm sharing the right screen for purposes of this recording. This one, desktop one, let's record that one. Okay. So in this, I'm just going to go to some GitLab examples and show you a couple of these examples. So the first one I want to show you is pipelines. So let's go to this one. This has some old pipelines. And when I look at my CI/CD view and look at the pipelines, I see this big list of pipelines, and the primary thing that jumps out to me is this number. And the thing that I can click into to drill down into this pipeline is the number, but the number is meaningless to me. There are probably some other things about the pipeline other than just the triggerer and the commit that are important to me. Like, was this a feature branch pipeline, or was this a master branch pipeline? Those kinds of things. So when I think about pipelines and what we would do to make this more understandable, even when I drill into this specific pipeline, it gives me the commit name, which is kind of helpful, but I really want to know that commit name and whether or not, I think for me, it's that it is a master pipeline and that this is the commit. So maybe some kind of hash of master dash the first couple of maybe first 20 or 30 characters of the commit would help me when I'm looking at it in a pipeline view, or someone sends me a link with a reference. Instead of just seeing the number, I see something actually useful to me that would help me understand what I'm looking at. It takes a little bit of cognitive load for me to just go from, let's just say somebody randomly sent me this link. I follow the link. Here I am looking at this pipeline. It takes me some time to figure out what exactly am I looking at. I have to parse master, that this is the commit. This is the commit reference down here, I believe. Yeah, so this would be the reference for that commit SHA, telling me what changed. But it would be great if at the top, instead of just saying the name and this pipeline number, it said something more useful that helped me identify what this pipeline was doing. The exact same pattern happens with jobs. Jobs have a name that are typically defined by the user, but we don't put that front and center. So the job name is defined in your CI YAML. In this case, these are probably from an auto DevOps template, but we don't surface those as the first thing. We surface these as this kind of like a artifact later on the stage in the name, but some sort of reference instead of using the job number that said, hey, this stage is cleanup and the name is X, and you click on this, it'll go into it, and then here's where the pipeline that specific job was run during. Those kinds of things reduce the cognitive load. So when I'm looking at this, I don't have to think like, oh, what in the world are all these various numbers, and then go look over here for what stage was in my pipeline and what the name of the job was. So jobs are another example where I think we add a bunch of cognitive load for our users when we don't necessarily have to. That there's a way that our users think about these objects in our application, and we should just surface those more natively. Let's look at some other things in the ops section and see if we can spot any other examples. Let's look at environments. Okay, so environments, makes sense. Deployment 217. I'm actually not sure if that is a job number. So this deployment number maybe is a place where we're using a number, but we don't have to. This is the actual job that did the deployment, but maybe we keep separate track of this number, but it would be great to reference more. Yeah, I think that the naming, if you're going to auto name it, would kind of be based on the commit and the fact that it was a master deploy and that this went to production. So at least the environments have a name, but some of this other additional information about them environments as a thing doesn't necessarily tell me much information. Let me see if I can find another environments example. So this is a common auto DevOps application that I know will have environments for our pajamas design system. If I look in operations at environments, let's just look and see. So it has a lot of different deployments. If I look at the status, okay, so yeah, this ID is just number of deployments so that you could do things like rollback. Those are deployment jobs, probably specifically, and we've given them a unique number. But again, this ID number is not super useful, but it's the first thing we put in front of users' line of sight when they're looking at this list. And I don't know, the job information is pretty much useless because it cuts off where I would actually find some valuable information. I don't think there's any way I can get it big enough to go me anything more than that number. Yeah, and so the commit is interesting. It would be great if instead of ID and job, we had something that gave me a useful way to look at this and understand what the actual change was. Or maybe at a minimum, you just move the commit column over, since that's the kind of core thing that appears to change. In this case, it looks like they're doing some semantic versioning with their commit messages. So even that, just only having a handful of characters, you're already using a bunch of them for that automation of, I would imagine, some release content. Okay, let's go back. This is my example app that I run a bunch of these pipelines a long time ago. Hold on, that happened to me once before. When you're in Zoom and you accidentally zoom with your magic mouse, it gets stuck. Okay, let's look at other things in operations here. These are metrics. So let's give me good, useful names. The environment has a name. The metrics have names. Yeah, that one's fine. Logs. Okay, pods. I think these pods get automatically named. So it would be great if when we think about pod names, and that probably also surfaces in environments, we had some way to kind of give you the usefulness of the pod name. So maybe it's like production, and when there are these generic kind of UUIDs, you would do just numbers to help our users understand. And maybe the mouse server gives you some more detail. And then this Postgres sidecar app, we would want to call just what we're calling it. The fact that I'm already scoped to production and it's still telling me production, maybe not as useful to duplicate that there. But overall, not the same pattern that we were seeing. Error tracking, let's look at errors. So this one's cool. In open errors, it's giving me a specific name from that error. That's great. Let me see, I think we have Tanuki. It might have some better errors tracking more items. Yeah, okay, so here's a great example. Most important information is right here, this name of the error. Looks like, yeah, that same thing is applied here. Instead of using some tracking issue number or something like that, we are using a very specific name that helps me identify the errors. That's great. Let's look at alerts. Yeah, so severity is probably the most important thing. Time, most recency is great. And then the alert name has both a number and some brief description. That's cool. Maybe we don't need the number in that case. When I click on it, it takes me to the alert detail. Yeah, so maybe the alert is not super helpful. Sorry, the alert number is not super helpful, but still great that we've got an actual alert name. Let's look at incidents. Okay, so here's a bunch of incidents similar. I like this. Start with severity. Then we've got an incident name, time created, SLA. That makes sense. The instance, yeah, I'll have a name. And in these cases, I think in the incident, users can edit the name. Is that true of alerts too? Can I edit the name? No, I can't. So that's cool. It picked a useful name, even though a user didn't provide it. This was probably in some automated fashion when creating the alert integration, but great to see that it's not, that we're using something that doesn't add a bunch of cognitive load to our users by making a smart kind of conventional choice. We talked about incidents. Serverless is going to tell me, I think I have an app with serverless on it. Let me find that one. That will show me the functions. So here's some functions for serverless. Let's see what happens when I look at them. No, I think I removed the Knative installation there. So let's go back. We talked about environments. Oh, pods, that was what I was gonna say. Yeah, so here's an example where the environments show pods. And in this case, they're all not super useful. I know there's 5 of them, I can hover over them, but their names don't distinguish anything for me. So it's not like I can reference them easily. Maybe having some other way to reference them would be great. Let's look at feature flags. Yeah, my feature flags have an ID, but they also have a name, and I get to supply that name, I believe. So here, yeah, I got to supply the name, so that's great. It shows me the name. Maybe we don't need ID here as the first one. We just want status feature flag. The ID is not important to me, especially if I had a link that I could just copy, and the link URL would have the ID. What else? Oh, let's look at Kubernetes. So in this case, I have a cluster. Great, look, it's showing me super important information. I think this logo tells me that's in GKE. It has the name of the cluster. Then it talks about environment scope. Never mentions that this is cluster number 106958, right? And I think this is probably a shining example of what I'm highlighting. In fact, I would never know when I were looking at this, had I not looked at the URL, what the cluster ID is. And I think that's probably the behavior we will want to go for, which is the idea of these individual objects doesn't matter, and our users generally don't reference or think about them that way. What is useful is that we provide information when they're shown in context that is immediately useful and doesn't require some deciphering. And if we can obfuscate the ID entirely, even better. So yeah, actually I'm going to use this Kubernetes clusters as kind of like my shining example of what lists of things should look like. This only has one cluster. Let me see if I can find one that has multiple. Tanuki, does it have multiple? Yeah, okay. So here's a couple of different clusters that are available to this project. The project itself, like this display is not telling me individual numbers. In fact, some of them are like in wildly, I'm looking at the URLs down here. Some of them are in wildly different projects, but what's important is that I'm showing useful information to my user up front and hiding not useful information like the ID. And let's look at packages. Maybe there's some stuff in packages. Oh yeah, actually I think this should have some packages in our container registry. Okay, so here's my list of tags for my container. Yeah, so here's another example where latest is useful. That's, I know what that means, but these other ones, the UUID or whatever this hash is not super useful to me, and is not really something I would ever reference. So maybe having something like the date it was published over on this side, I get that I would want to copy this so that I could retrieve this specific one, but in terms of my readability, I would want when it was published, if that's the best information we have. Maybe there's some other information about published to, there's some other digest information, but maybe that's the best information we have about this container image. And I imagine similar is true for package registry. I'm trying to think if we, where are we dog fooding? Container registry. No, just container registry in GitLab. And yeah, here we have the package registry, but no packages in here. But in that case, I guess I would highlight, you would want to make sure that you're not giving users, especially on the like leftmost column for those of us who read from left to right, you would want to give information that is more descriptive than just the ID, which is not super descriptive. So I think that is all. I think I highlighted the things I really wanted to touch on. Test cases is not really in the ops section, but let's just use that as an example. Yeah, this project doesn't have any. Yeah, in this case, it's great. You're showing test case as the primary thing. You named it, then you get the ID. I think issues do a good job of this too. Let's just look, yeah, it's the exact same kind of behavior where you're giving the most useful information with the number being not super useful. So that, I'm gonna stop my recording. Or actually, let me just stop my share. Oh wait, was I not sharing that whole time? Oh yeah, stop share. Okay, I was sharing the whole time. And again, highlight, I think for me, it was Vitka who had brought this up in walking through one of our design visions for the pipeline view, but I think this is kind of consistent. I would describe it as anti-pattern in the ops section, where a lot of our objects were not thinking through and making it easy for our users to think through what is that object specifically compared to the other ones in the list. And by just giving the number, we're not making it easier for our users to understand the distinction between the different items in a list. So with that, I will stop sharing. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope this is helpful.